There are 10 specific things that genuinely destabilize a narcissist more than almost anything else you could say or do. And here's what makes them so effective. None of them are things you're doing to him. They're simply what happens naturally when you stop organizing your life around his reactions and start living according to your own genuine boundaries, your own genuine peace, your own genuine growth. He experiences these as devastating precisely because they're not performances aimed at him, they're proof that you no longer need him in order to be whole. Let's walk through all 10 because understanding why each one lands so hard reveals something important about how his entire psychology actually works. The first thing, you stop explaining yourself. Not out of anger, not as a punishment, but because you've genuinely reached a point where his understanding of your choices is no longer something you require in order to make them. This is worth understanding at a deeper level because most people assume a narcissist wants agreement, wants to win every argument outright. What he actually depends on is your continued participation in the argument itself, your willingness to keep explaining, justifying, defending your position, because that ongoing engagement is what confirms he still matters enough to warrant the effort. When you simply state something once and stop elaborating, when "because I said so" or "that's my decision" becomes a complete sentence rather than an opening line, you remove the raw material his psychology depends on to stay engaged. The second thing, you stop reacting to his mood. For most of the relationship, some part of you was probably scanning constantly, reading his tone before you spoke, adjusting your own behavior to avoid whatever version of him might be waiting in a given room. When this scanning genuinely stops, not through willpower alone, but through the deeper release of actually no longer needing to manage his emotional state, something significant shifts. His moods, once a reliable tool for controlling the emotional temperature of any interaction, simply stop producing the ripple effect they used to produce in you. The third thing, you start setting boundaries without justifying them. "I'm not comfortable with that" becomes a complete boundary rather than the opening argument of a case you need to win. This matters enormously because a narcissist skilled at picking apart justifications has almost nothing to work with when a boundary arrives as simple fact rather than a position requiring defense. The fourth thing, you become visibly, genuinely fine without him, not performing wellness for an audience, but actually building a life, new interests, new connections, a sense of stability that has nothing to do with whether he's pleased with you. This directly contradicts whatever story he needs to believe about your inability to function without him. And visible reality is far harder to argue against than any confrontation could ever be. The fifth thing, you stop trying to make him understand your pain. You release the exhausting project of finding the perfect words that might finally make him grasp how much something hurt. This isn't giving up on being understood in general. It's recognizing that his understanding was never actually available in the form you kept hoping to receive it in. The sixth thing, your apologies stop arriving automatically. For a long time, you may have found yourself apologizing reflexively, even for things that weren't your fault, simply to restore peace faster than waiting out an argument would. When this stops, when an apology only comes attached to something you actually did wrong and never simply to smooth over a tension you didn't create, something in the relationship's usual rhythm breaks down. He's accustomed to conflicts resolving through your effort, your concession, your willingness to take on blame that was never really yours in order to end the discomfort sooner. When that supply of automatic apology disappears, arguments that used to resolve quickly simply sit there, unresolved because you're no longer the one absorbing the cost of ending them. The seventh thing, you stop being predictable in the specific way he's used to. Not chaotic or erratic, the opposite actually. You become predictable in a new, unfamiliar way. Consistently calm, consistently boundaried, consistently unmoved by tactics that used to reliably produce a reaction. This particular kind of predictability is far more disorienting than inconsistency would be, because he spent years refining a strategy built around anticipating and working with your old reactive patterns. A completely different, stable pattern renders that entire strategy obsolete overnight. The eighth thing, You allow him to experience the consequences of his own choices. For years, you may have softened landings that were never yours to soften, smoothing over the fallout of his decisions before it could reach him fully, absorbing friction so he never had to. When you stop doing this, not out of spite, but simply because it was never actually your job in the first place, he encounters, often for the first time, the direct, unfiltered result of his own behavior. This is genuinely destabilizing because he's likely never had to build the internal capacity to handle consequences without someone else quietly managing them on his behalf. The ninth thing, you become someone other people trust more than they trust him. This isn't something you're actively engineering. It happens naturally once you stop covering for him. Stop making excuses to friends and family on his behalf. Stop managing the version of him that reaches the outside world. As people start seeing him more clearly, your credibility, quiet, consistent, demonstrated through years of behavior rather than performance, starts to outweigh whatever story he's telling. This shift, happening gradually and mostly outside his direct awareness, threatens exactly the kind of social capital his confidence has always depended on. The 10th thing, you genuinely stop needing him to change. This is the deepest one, and in many ways the culmination of everything else on this list. For most of the relationship, some part of you was likely still hoping that enough patience, enough love, enough clear communication might eventually produce the person you always believed he could become. When that hope genuinely, fully releases, not through resignation, but through real acceptance of who he's actually shown himself to be, something fundamental shifts in the entire dynamic. He can no longer locate in you the audience still waiting for his transformation. And a narcissist without an audience still holding out hope for his eventual redemption loses access to one of the most powerful, least visible sources of leverage he's ever had. Now here's what matters most about all 10 of these things, and it's worth understanding clearly before we close this out. None of them were ever meant to be deployed as a strategy. If you find yourself reading back through this list and thinking about how to actively perform each one, timing your lack of reaction for maximum effect, calculating exactly when to withhold an apology, deliberately allowing consequences to land in a way specifically designed to destabilize him, you've actually missed the entire point, and worse, you've likely built something fragile rather than something real. Here's why this distinction matters so much. Every one of these 10 things works precisely because it isn't performed. A narcissist's psychology, as we've discussed throughout this entire series, is remarkably attuned to detecting the difference between genuine indifference and strategic withholding, between real boundaries and calculated ones, between authentic peace and a performance of peace, still secretly hoping for a particular reaction underneath it. If any of these 10 things become tools you're consciously wielding to produce a specific effect in him, you've reintroduced exactly the kind of investment in his response that keeps you tethered to him, even while appearing on the surface to have moved past needing anything from him at all. The real version of all 10 of these things develops slowly through the same kind of internal work we've discussed across this entire series, releasing the need for his approval, rebuilding a sense of self-worth that doesn't fluctuate based on his reactions, learning to tolerate his disappointment without rushing to fix it, trusting your own perception over his attempts to reframe it. When this internal work is genuinely done, these 10 behaviors emerge naturally as simple byproducts of who you've become, rather than as tactics requiring conscious execution and careful timing. This is worth understanding as the actual difference between two people who might look from the outside like they're doing exactly the same things. One is performing detachment as a strategy, hoping it produces his crack, his realization, his eventual change. The other has genuinely internally moved past needing any of those outcomes at all, and her behavior simply reflects that reality, whether or not he ever notices, understands, or reacts to it in any particular way. Here's what's worth understanding about why he experiences these 10 things as so destabilizing, even though none of them are aimed at him specifically. His entire sense of self, as we've discussed throughout this series, depends on external input to remain coherent. And each of these 10 things represents the quiet, natural withdrawal of a specific kind of input he's come to depend on without ever consciously recognizing how dependent he'd become. Your explanations, your reactivity to his moods, your automatic apologies, your management of his consequences, your hope for his eventual change, all of these functioned as a kind of ongoing life support for a fragile, externally regulated identity, whether you ever intended them to serve that function or not. When you withdraw them not as punishment but simply because you no longer need to offer them, the withdrawal itself produces genuine destabilization regardless of your intent. This is the final, most important thing to understand as we close out this discussion. You are not responsible for his stability, and you never actually were, even during all the years you spent unknowingly providing it. These 10 things aren't things you're taking away from him out of cruelty. They're simply things you're finally rightfully keeping for yourself. Your own explanations reserved for people who've earned them. Your own emotional energy no longer spent managing someone else's moods. Your own apologies reserved for things you actually did wrong. Your own hope no longer poured into someone who's shown you repeatedly that it was never going to be rewarded. If you're currently in the process of building these 10 things in your own life, whether in relation to this specific person or as a broader pattern you're developing after everything this relationship taught you, I want you to release any pressure to make them look a certain way, land a certain way, or produce any particular reaction in him at all. Build them because you deserve to stop explaining yourself to people who were never actually listening. Build them because your own peace was always worth more than his comfort. Build them because you're tired, finally, of being the only one holding up a structure that was never yours to carry in the first place. Whatever he does in response, whether he loses his mind, as this video's title suggests, or whether he barely seems to notice at all, was never actually the point. The point was always only you finally becoming someone who no longer needs to track his reaction in order to know you're doing exactly the right thing. There's something worth addressing directly here because it's a genuine common concern for people building these 10 things in real time. What happens on the days when it doesn't feel natural at all? When explaining yourself still feels like the only way to be heard, when his mood still pulls at you despite everything you understand intellectually, when the old automatic apology still slips out before you've had time to catch it. This is worth naming, honestly, because presenting these 10 things as a clean, linear progression from old pattern to new pattern would be misleading, and it would set up exactly the kind of unfair, all-or-nothing standard we've cautioned against throughout this entire series. The truth is that building these 10 things almost never happens in a straight line. You might find yourself holding a boundary perfectly for weeks, genuinely unmoved by tactics that used to work reliably, only to catch yourself over-explaining a simple decision during a moment of exhaustion or stress. This isn't evidence that the underlying work wasn't real. It's evidence that you're human, navigating a genuinely difficult, gradual process of unlearning patterns that were often built over years, sometimes over an entire lifetime, in response to relationships and environments that predate this specific person entirely. A single moment of reverting to an old pattern doesn't erase months of genuine growth, the same way a single missed workout doesn't erase months of built strength. What matters is the overall trajectory, not the perfect, unbroken consistency of every single moment holding exactly as it should. It's also worth understanding something important about why some of these 10 things might develop faster than others, because they don't all require the same depth of internal work to become genuine rather than performed. Boundaries without justification, for instance, often develop relatively quickly once you've practiced the specific skill of stating something once and resisting the urge to elaborate. It's a fairly mechanical habit that responds well to repeated deliberate practice. Genuinely, Fully releasing the hope that he'll change, on the other hand, tends to be the deepest and slowest of all 10, precisely because it requires fully grieving something significant. The relationship you once believed was possible, the version of him you held on to even through real harm, the future you may have quietly imagined for a very long time before finally accepting it was never actually coming. This grief cannot be rushed, and expecting the 10th thing on this list to arrive on the same timeline as the more mechanical, practice-based ones sets up an unrealistic standard that ignores how genuinely different these 10 things actually are from each other. I want to address one more thing directly because it's a question that often surfaces once people start building genuine versions of these 10 behaviors. Does becoming this version of yourself mean you've become cold or hardened or somehow less capable of the deep empathy that made you who you were before this relationship? This concern deserves a clear, honest answer because it's one of the most common fears people carry into this kind of internal work. The answer is no, and it's worth understanding precisely why. Every one of these 10 things is about where your empathy, your patience, and your emotional generosity actually go, not about whether you still possess them at all. You haven't lost the capacity to explain yourself to people who genuinely deserve that explanation. You haven't lost the capacity to be moved by someone's genuine distress. You haven't lost the capacity to apologize when you're actually wrong, to hope for people who've demonstrated they're actually capable of growth, to soften consequences for people who haven't spent years teaching you that doing so simply enables more harm. What's changed isn't the depth of what you're capable of offering. It's the discernment about who actually deserves it, built through real, often painful experience that taught you the difference the hard way. This distinction matters enormously for how you carry these 10 things forward into every relationship you'll ever have, not just this specific one. The version of you who no longer explains herself to someone who was never listening is the same version of you who will explain herself fully, patiently, and generously to someone who actually engages honestly with what she says. The version of you who no longer manages someone else's moods reflexively is the same version of you who will offer genuine comfort to someone going through something real, without that comfort ever curdling into the kind of exhausting, one-directional labor you spent years providing here. Nothing about building these 10 things forecloses your capacity for deep connection going forward. If anything, it protects that capacity, ensuring it never again gets extracted so completely by someone incapable of offering anything comparable back, that you lose access to it the way you may have started to feel yourself losing access to it during the hardest parts of this relationship. If you're currently somewhere in the middle of building these 10 things, some genuinely automatic now, others still requiring conscious effort, one or two perhaps still feeling entirely out of reach, understand that this uneven, non-linear process is exactly what real internal change actually looks like, regardless of how clean and complete it might sound described in a list like this one. Trust the direction you're moving in, even on the days it doesn't feel complete. Trust that the 10 things still requiring effort today will, with enough continued practice, eventually join the ones that have already become simply who you are, without conscious thought required to sustain them. And trust that wherever you currently stand in this process, you are already genuinely doing the work that actually matters, not performing it for an audience, not measuring it against his reaction, but building it quietly and consistently for the only person who is ever actually going to benefit from it in any lasting way.